Well, sometimes you think you're in for a pretty normal day and then wham, something big happens.
Yeah, like yesterday.
Exactly. President Trump just made a huge announcement from the White House about this new reciprocal tariff policy. And, well, it's got everyone talking.
Yeah, for sure. And for good reason. This isn't just some small adjustment. It's a complete game changer for how the U.S. trades with practically every other country.
So let's break down what exactly this reciprocal tariff thing is all about. The word reciprocal kind of makes me think of a mirror, right? Like reflecting something back.
That's a good way to think about it. Basically, the U.S. is saying, hey, whatever tariff you slap on American goods, we're going to try to hit you back with about half of that on your goods coming into the U.S. But it's actually a bit more complex than just matching existing tariffs.
How so?
Well, the administration has also taken into account what they're calling non-monetary barriers, which are basically things that aren't direct taxes but still make it tougher for American companies to compete on a level playing field.
Hmm. Non-monetary barriers. That sounds a little vague. Can you give this some specific examples?
Sure, think of things like super specific regulations in certain industries or customs procedures that are a total nightmare, complicated and slow, or even those subsidies some foreign governments give their own companies, which kind of gives them an unfair advantage. All this stuff is being factored in when the U.S. calculates these new reciprocal rates. And then on top of all that, there's a baseline 10% tariff on every single thing coming into the U.S. starting on April 5th.
Oh, wow. So that 10% is the lowest it could be.
Yeah, exactly. But for certain countries, that actual tariff could be way, way higher based on these reciprocal calculations.
I did see that the stock market took a bit of a dip after the announcement, which makes sense, right?
Absolutely. Stock futures dropped pretty sharply. It's a classic reaction when something this big and uncertain hits the global economy. Markets really don't like surprises.
Well, let's dive into some of the specific tariff rates that were announced. China, as we all expected, was front and center. What kind of hit are they taking?
Yeah, President Trump announced a 34% reciprocal tariff for goods from China. And get this is on top of the 20% tariffs that were already in effect for loads of Chinese products.
Okay, so if we do the math, what's that total tariff looking like for a lot of goods from China come April 9th?
It adds up to a whopping 54%. I mean, that's massive. It's definitely a way more aggressive stance toward China and their trade practices. Makes you wonder how a tariff that big is going to shake things up for both economies long term.
For sure. A jump that huge will definitely have consequences down the line. So what about our friends over in Europe? Any word on what the EU is facing?
The EU's got a 20% tariff on everything they send to the U.S. And let me tell you, people are not happy. France in particular didn't hold back, calling it, get this, an imperialist posture.
Wow, imperialist posture. That's pretty hard. What kind of counter moves can we expect from the EU?
I think it's pretty safe to say the EU is going to retaliate. We're already hearing chatter about them getting ready to hit back with their own tariffs on American goods if negotiations don't go their way. This could snowball into a full-blown trade war.
It sounds like things could get really messy. Let's move on to Southeast Asia. I noticed Vietnam got hit pretty hard.
Yeah, they're looking at a 46% tariff under this new policy. And for a country that's become a manufacturing powerhouse, that's a huge blow.
Taiwan is also a big player in all the global tech stuff, right? What about them?
Yeah, Taiwan's facing a 32% tariff on their exports to the U.S. This could mean pricier electronics and tech components for us, potentially.
And even some of our allies weren't totally spared. Norway got hit with a lower rate, but it still caused quite a stir.
Yeah, it was only 15% for Norway. But even though that's lower than some others, the Prime Minister of Norway still called it bad news and stressed how much it could hurt Norwegian companies and jobs. He said they're definitely going to try and negotiate with the U.S. about it.
Wow, it really shows just how widespread these tariffs are. Were there any sectors or countries that were given a pass, at least for now?
There are a few exceptions, at least initially. Pharmaceutical products are one big one. But President Trump did say that future tariffs on pharmaceuticals are still a possibility, so maybe it's just a temporary break.
A bit of a wait and see situation. So, besides pharmaceuticals, what else got a pass?
A bunch of raw materials and stuff we don't have a lot of here in the U.S. are also excluded for the time being. We're talking copper, semiconductors, lumber, bullion, all sorts of energy products and certain minerals. It looks like they're trying to avoid messing up domestic production that depends on imports.
That makes sense strategically. What about all those goods that were already subject to tariffs from earlier trade actions?
Oh, all those products that were already hit with recent tariffs like steel, aluminum, cars, and car parts, they're all currently exempt from these new reciprocal tariffs. It seems like they're focusing this new policy on things that haven't been targeted recently.
Makes sense. And what about Canada and Mexico? They're our biggest trading partners, right? How does this all affect them?
So right now, Canada and Mexico are off the hook for both that baseline 10% tariff and the new reciprocal tariffs. But, and this is important, this exemption is totally tied to those 25% tariffs we already have on some of their imports staying in place.
Oh, so it's not a done deal.
Not exactly. If those 25% duties get dropped or suspended, then boom, that new 10% baseline tariff kicks right in for Canada and Mexico. So they're kind of in limbo. Their status is linked to those older trade measures. It's all very interesting how it's all connected.
It is. Feels like the ground's still shifting under our feet. Okay, let's talk about how these tariffs might actually hit specific industries and companies. The auto industry is probably feeling pretty nervous right about now.
Definitely top of mind. The auto industry's got some big changes to deal with. Starting at midnight last night, on April 2nd, a 25% tariff went into effect on all imported vehicles that aren't put together here in the U.S. I mean, that's a serious cost hike. Could affect both the companies making cars and all of us who buy them.
And it's not just the finished cars, is it? They're also thinking about tariffs on all the parts that go into them.
Exactly. They could be hitting things like engines and transmissions with tariffs soon. And, the car industry is super global. Parts come from all over, so this could really shake things up, even for cars made right here in the U.S.
So which countries that ship a lot of cars to the U.S. might be in trouble?
Slovakia, for one. They
Yeah.
send tons of cars to the U.S., so they could be hit really hard. Their whole economy kind of depends on that trade.
I wouldn't have thought of them.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see the global connections, This whole thing even affects beer and aluminum cans, believe it or not.
Yep. They're putting a 25% tariff on all that imported beer made with malt, and on those empty aluminum cans, too. So yeah, that six-pack you like, or that can of sparkling water, could be more expensive soon.
I saw something about them closing a loophole, too, the de minimis rule. What's that about?
Right, so the de minimis rule basically says that if you ship something worth less than $800, it gets into the U.S. without any import taxes. But President Trump just signed an order to get rid of that starting May 2nd.
So what happens to all those smaller, cheap shipments after May 2nd?
Well, if it used to sneak in duty-free, now it'll get hit with either a 30% duty based on how much it's worth or a flat $25 per item, whichever is more. And then on June 1st, it jumps up again to $50 per item, no matter what it's worth.
Wow, that's going to be a big change for online sellers and people who buy lots of little things from overseas. Didn't the market react to this, too?
Yeah, PDD Holdings, the company that owns Temu, that online marketplace, their stock took a hit after hours. That's because their whole business model is about sending these small duty-free packages. This new policy really messes with that.
Okay, let's talk about the global reaction. We already heard France's take, pretty fiery. What are other countries saying?
China's not messing around. They basically told the U.S. to drop these tariffs immediately, and they promised to hit back hard to protect their economic interests. They see this whole thing as a very one-sided protectionist move.
Not a big surprise there, given how big their tariffs are. What about Canada? We're like best buds with them trade-wise.
Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said they're going to fight this with force, and they're putting together a bunch of countermeasures. I think they'll announce them today. What's interesting is there's some pushback here in the U.S., too. The Senate actually passed a resolution to get rid of the tariffs on Canada, but who knows what will happen in the House.
So not everyone in the U.S. is on board with this. What about Mexico? What are they saying?
Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, said they're not planning to play the you hit me, I hit you back game with tariffs. Seems like they're more focused on keeping things stable with the U.S. and avoiding a trade war.
Makes sense. Australia had a pretty interesting response, too, a bit more subtle than some.
Yeah, their prime minister, Anthony Albanese, said these tariffs are not the act of a friend. But he also said they're not going to retaliate with their own tariffs. And it's worth mentioning that President Trump specifically called out Australia for banning American beef during his announcement.
So maybe a bit tension there. And what about South Korea, another big exporter to the U.S.?
South Korea's acting president ordered up some emergency support for the industries that are going to feel the pain from this. And he plans to talk to the U.S., really negotiate to try and minimize the damage from these tariffs.
What about other Asian economies?
Malaysia said they're not thinking about retaliatory tariffs right now and are focusing on working with U.S. policymakers to try to ensure what they consider fair trade practices. And Singapore's monetary authority chimed in. They said they're ready to step in if their currency starts going crazy because of all this market uncertainty.
Wow, so many different reactions from all over the globe. Some are mad as heck, others are more, let's talk this out. Okay, so trying to understand the Trump administration's logic here, what's their main argument for these tariffs?
Basically, they're saying these tariffs are crucial for getting the U.S. to be economically independent. They're talking
Yeah.
about a golden age of America and all that. Their big focus is on protecting American industries and getting manufacturing back here in the U.S.
And what's the upside, according to them? What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, their thinking is, if they make imports more expensive, American companies will be more likely to either start making stuff here or ramp up their production in the U.S. And that, they believe, will create jobs and boost domestic production. They're also claiming that more competition within the U.S. will actually lead to lower prices for American consumers eventually.
And let's be real, tariffs have always been a way to get leverage in trade talks, right? Is that part of the strategy here?
Oh, definitely. Using tariffs as a way to pressure other countries to change their trade agreements or deal with what the U.S. sees as unfair practices is a key part of this. It's about forcing them to come to the negotiating table.
Right. But as we've heard from the global reaction, not everyone's buying it. A lot of people are worried and pretty opposed to this whole thing. What are some of the big criticisms besides what France and Norway said?
There's this one veteran economist, he was really blunt. He said that absolutely nothing good will come out of this, that it's going to be bad news for the global economy. No sugarcoating there.
Yikes. What about concerns here in the U.S.?
Well, Democratic Senator Welch warned that these tariffs are just going to hike prices for American shoppers, plain and simple. He called it a half-baked trade war. A lot of businesses, especially the smaller ones, are worried about how much more they'll have to pay for imported parts and stuff. They're also worried about their supply chains getting messed up. And with all this uncertainty, advertisers are asking for more flexible contracts. They're worried they won't be able to predict how much things will cost in the future. And if you look at how the stock market's reacting, it's pretty clear investors are nervous about what this means for corporate profits and the overall economic picture.
Man, it sounds like things are about to get pretty chaotic. So, just to sum things up, President Trump announced a whole bunch of new tariffs on goods from all over the world, and the rates are based on this idea of reciprocity. They're aiming to charge about half of whatever other countries hit American goods with, and they're also thinking about those non monetary barriers we talked about.
Yeah, good summary. And the reactions from everyone else have been all over the place. Some are totally against it and talk about retaliation. Others are really worried and want to negotiate. And the stock market's been going up and down like a roller coaster. Everyone's a bit on edge with all this uncertainty.
And this isn't just a bunch of numbers on paper, it's going to have real world effects. Industries like the car industry are going to be hit,
Yeah.
and every day folks might see prices go up on stuff they buy regularly, things like beer. And then there's that change to the de minimis rule, which is going to affect all those small online purchases.
Exactly. Businesses are going to have to adapt fast, and shoppers might start seeing changes in prices and what's available. The big question is what happens next. How will this affect trade relationships between countries and the global economy? It's all up in the air right now.
This really does feel like a turning point in global trade. Given all the strong opinions and reactions we've heard, what do you think the long-term fallout from these tariffs will be? How will this change how countries do business with each other and the overall balance of economic power in the world? I think we're all going to be watching very closely to see how this plays out.